Hello, and welcome to another special deep dive edition of Football Today. I'm your host, Josh Schneider-Weiler, and today we are joined by my good friend and football broadcaster, David Goss. David, how are you doing today?
I'm fantastic. I feel like a lot of the topics we take on kind of have like a sigh to it at times, but this one's like Pele. It is happiness, it's joy, it's Brazil, it's soccer, it's football, it's everything.
Yeah, man, this is like a very uplifting topic, a very positive one in general, maybe not in all cases, as we'll get to later in the episode, but definitely a good topic. And, you know, it's always fun to see a football documentary or just a documentary in general, I think. Before we get to the documentary, though, about Pele, which is what our episode will be talking about today, what image comes to your mind when you think of Pele? You know, what did you know about Pele when you were growing up as a child?
So he's the MJ, right? He's the greats in other sports. He's the one that everyone, if you bring up that sport, especially in America, that's the first name that people say. Oh, like Pele. And, you know, little kids would dribble and play and they'd be like, oh, he's like Pele. That was the one name everyone knew, everyone felt comfortable with. And then I would say growing up in New York, you learned about the New York Cosmos. And there's a great documentary also that people should watch called Once in a Lifetime of his time at the Cosmos. And so in my mind, Pele was greatness, and he was always associated with the 70s, with the era of love and free spirit and all that stuff and disco and all that, because that was his greatness in America, and he connected himself with that when he was with the Cosmos. So that's kind of was always my image of him. And then this documentary, what's great for me was this went backwards and was basically everything before that and never really touched that, which kind of completed the story for me. And I don't know if you remember, but we went to the first ever New York Red Bulls game when they changed their name from the Metro Stars, and they brought back old greats and they connected themselves to the Cosmos. And Franz Beckenbauer was there and Carlos Alberto was there and Pele was there as well. And he came out last. And the one thing I remember is Giant Stadium, fairly full, not sold out because that's how it works. And everyone came out and they were announced and they walked to the center circle and waved, and that was it. And Pele walks out and just does his own thing, walks around the full field, peace sign, shaking hands in the crowd. And Beckenbauer took about 35 seconds to be announced, and Pele took about 25 minutes, and everyone loved it. And I think it was the highlight of the day. So it was those moments. That's how I always kind of thought of Pele, was this feel-good love character.
Yeah, I mean, he was known, you know, for me when I was a kid, like he was like kind of the ambassador of football. He was Mr. Football. Like every World Cup, they would trot him out. You would see like, you know, a couple commercials of him. You would get that like highlights package that they would, you know, seemingly always run of him at the 58 World Cup. And, you know, that's kind of what my image was of him. And he was like the first footballer that I think anyone in America really knew, that was of people that were our age, at least. He was the first person that you thought of when you thought of football, at least for me growing up. And it sounds like, you know, for you as well. So let's dig into the documentary, because the best part about this was learning so much about kind of his early life and, you know, about pre-1970, pre-New York Cosmos stuff. So I think the two main topics that were kind of explored in this documentary, in my opinion, was one, making kind of Brazil an international football power. And the second was how Brazilian politicians use Pele and football for their benefit. So I want to first talk about how Pele put Brazil on the map, if you will. You know, Dave, what did you make of him putting Brazil on the map? They're quite like, the first thing that they show you is 1958, right? And that World Cup, and they talk about the horrors of the 1950 World Cup. So, you know, what were your thoughts on that?
So it's hard to look back and not think of Brazil as the football nation. Like, it's hard to, even watching this, not assume Brazil's the favorites in everything they went into, and not assume that they're the giants of the game and they have expectations and belief that they're going to win. And so you have to remember 1930, you've got a Uruguay-Argentina final, obviously in Uruguay, and those are the two powers of South America, and their clubs are the powers of South America. And so one of the great things, and I think I read it in David Goldblatt's book, Football, a Brazil, you know, Soccer Nation, is not only did Brazil not have a footballing background, there aren't really any big moments in Brazilian history that they stand and look at. So they don't have a big revolution and a revolutionary leader. And they don't have these grand moments where they went from, being a colony to being independent, or being an empire to being free. And so the footballers in that nation, they are their national heroes. And that is their national mythology and their national identity. Every country has these independence characters who we turn into cartoons, right? And the men of the French Revolution weren't exactly who we say they were now. And the Roman Republic, and of course in the US we have George Washington and characters like that. You turn them into mythological cartoons. They're not really who they are anymore. Brazil didn't have those characters. And so Pele is that person. And those footballers are those people. And when you go to Brazil now, the paintings, the murals on the walls, all of them are of players. They're not of political leaders, and they're not of revolutionary leaders. And that's unique in the world. And so what Pele gave them was that cultural moment to start, not just from football, but as a country. And you see it in the documentary. The 60s was when the country started to get rolling and felt like they had found their feet as a nation. And 58 is when he's able to kind of take them to a next level and say, we can be great at something, and we can trust in ourselves and our own abilities. And for it to be a 17-year-old local kid who had never been overseas and who didn't care about other countries, I think is so fitting for what Brazil ended up becoming.
I think that's a great point you make about, like, he was their country's hero. And they say that in the documentary. I mean, the ex-president of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, said, quote, "Every country needs a hero. People need something to believe in." And he was that guy for them. And you talk about how they didn't have any kind of background of winning or anything. They called this in the documentary the mongrel complex, which they describe as like a street dog, I think, essentially. But I think we can't sell that point enough, that like they were not the Brazil that we know. It's almost like thinking of Liverpool as an underdog, right? Or in American baseball, the Yankees as like an underdog beneath someone else. Or Mike Tyson as an underdog, right? Like, it's just like some of these legends, right? It's just hard to imagine them as underdogs. And this documentary takes place over the course of 12 years, from 1958 to 1970. And by the end of the 12 years, Brazil is the number one international team in world football, like bar none. They have the most World Cup titles by the time he's done playing international football. So you can literally say that Pele took Brazil to the number one spot in world football, and they haven't been number two since, really.
Yeah. I would say the iconic image in the world of sports, any sport, it doesn't matter, is the Brazilian kit, is that yellow jersey, is the flair, is samba. Everyone knows that. And it is number one. To go into a little bit how bad the complex was, you mentioned the mongrel complex. The Maracanazo, which was the loss to Uruguay in 1950, they built the Maracanã, 200,000 people. It was going to be the coming out of the country. A lot of people don't remember, it was a group stage, second group stage, to win the World Cup. Brazil only had to tie Uruguay. So Brazil goes up 1-0, then Uruguay ties it 1-1. At that point, Brazil's still going to win the World Cup. They don't even have to win the game. They then proceed to lose 2-1. And so that is the magnitude of what happened. Was they had already basically backed themselves into winning the World Cup, and they still were not able to get it over the line. So that gives you even more context, I think, of what Pele and these young players had to get overcome going forward.
Yeah, and you mentioned the shirts and the shirt colors a moment ago as kind of the most recognizable shirt and jersey in all of sports. That was because of the 1970 World Cup, which was the first World Cup that was televised in color. And so, even he's the most recognizable face in the first World Cup in color. Brazil are the best team. He's leading them. I mean, I don't think we can really appreciate kind of how big that was. And for the brand of Brazilian football, we're in an age now of brands and, corporations and whatnot. But the first football brand is probably Brazil, and it's all kind of down to Pele and that 1970 World Cup.
I can say from a North American point of view, so that World Cup is an iconic moment. And of course, it was like the most easily broadcast first one in the Americas. In the Caribbean, like in Haiti, you root for Brazil first, then you root for your national team. Brazil is your home team because Pele was a black star playing the style they wanted to see. So in the Caribbean, bar none, because of that World Cup, you are a Brazil fan. In Mexico, the only line they see of how they see their national team and what they want to do is beating Brazil, because they saw Brazil in their country as this great footballing power and as the number one piece. So I can tell you, in 2021, the effect of that World Cup still in this region is massive. And as you said, Brazil proceeded to go on and be great. And so it's not just that moment, but that moment is held in time for so many people and passed through generations of what Brazil means and how it stands. And I know Brazil played a friendly in Haiti in the early 2000s, and no one had a Haiti jersey. Everyone's a Brazil fan. And that's what that World Cup did in an entire continent.
Yeah, I mean, he was the first major star of football in a time when, it was first, as they talk about in the movie, first coming to TV and first coming to a global audience, really. And I think that's also worth noting the impact, not just that he had internationally, but domestically with people in the country. They talk about how the pride that it gave them, and that they were finally had something that they could say they are the best in the world in. And, me and you are American. Like, this is something that American politicians use all the time. And we'll talk about a little bit more about nationalism coming up in a moment. But there is a lot of pride that you can get, even if it makes no sense, from your country being the best in the world at something. I thought about American basketball. American basketball is kind of the closest thing, I think, to Brazilian football in the world sense of there's one country that tends to dominate more than any other, and the kind of pride that comes. And I think that you can't put a price on that to give to 100 or 200 million people, that they feel like there is something in the world that their country is the best at, and they can take pride in that. Even if they're not a footballer, it doesn't matter. They know Pele, they can appreciate him, and they can claim him as their own. And I think that's really important.
And I would agree with your comparison in terms of, the success, but for what this was, the US invented basketball, right? And we're the best at it. This was a game invented by Europeans, then perfected by Argentina and Uruguay, who was your local countries you're chasing and the Europeans that you are trying to measure up to. And that is so much of why this was so important for the country, because it put them on a stage that they felt they'd never been on before, and put them in conversations that they felt earlier that they hadn't belonged in. And it's amazing when Pele starts the documentary and the footage of, horse carts going down the streets in Brazil in the 1940s, 1950s, where other countries had kind of already advanced technologically. And so you can see in Brazilians that feeling of inferiority, which is one of the things this team was able to kind of overcome.
Yeah, he flipped that inferiority complex, which is, once again, like, not something we can really appreciate as much now as I think people back then could. And I think there's a great quote. The co-director of the movie, Ben Nicholas, said, quote, "When he's feeling good, Brazil is feeling good, or vice versa." So in the movie, they really try to make a close link between Brazil and Pele and how the two are linked. And actually, this is a perfect little segue to get us to the other main topic in the documentary, which was the mixing of politics and football. What stood out to you in this area?
So you asked at the beginning what I knew about Pele and thought of, when I was younger and as I've learned about him in the game. And one of the things that in a way comes to mind is sort of like a perfectly formed sphere. And there's not a lot of little details that I know about him that don't feel like they're the stories that have been put out about him. Shining the shoes, his dad crying, listening to the 1950 game, those things. And I think that in watching this documentary, I realized that wasn't by accident. And Pele becomes famous at 17, and he's so young. And when you're watching the documentary, you see how easy he is to smile every time he sees the camera. And he's so charismatic looking, and he brings you in, and the way he played the game. But there wasn't a lot of nitty gritty I ever knew about him. And in watching this, I think I realized that was on purpose. He kept himself out of that. And you see that with this political conversation. No matter what, you can, as an athlete, it's very hard to win a political conversation because there's always people against you. There's a reason that two sides are in power, two sides are arguing. And so 50% or whatever that percentage is going to be, is going to stand against you if you speak out. And in watching this, Pele chose not to. And he pulled himself away from any potential of getting involved with this and stuck to the footballing side. And there was a little controversy in that, but that's nowhere near where this stands. And so when you think back on great athletes and you think about some of the negatives in their image and what they've done, I never thought of those with Pele. And I think this documentary kind of showed why. So on the political side, there's a military dictatorship that takes over Brazil in the middle of Pele's prime. So after he's already won that first World Cup.
Yeah, I think this is a good moment for a little background. I think this is a good moment to kind of like give the audience a little bit of background because they might not be too knowledgeable on politics in Brazil in the 1960s. And, to be fair, why would they? So in the 1960s, Brazil has a president at the time, and even the democratically elected president realizes the importance of Pele. The president at the time is Jânio Quadros, and he's only in office for a short amount of time, about 7 months. But in that time, he realizes the importance of Pele, and he actually makes him a national treasure in 1961, which means that he is not allowed to leave the country to join Real Madrid or Juventus. And there's a famous story of Juventus's chairman, Gianni Agnelli, going personally to visit Pele to offer him a share in Fiat to get him to join Juventus. So in 1961, they make him a national treasure. It means he can't leave the country for 10 years and join another club. So you can already see politics meshing with football there. And in 1964, there's a coup d'etat, and the military takes over the country. And, I thought something that they didn't really mention in the documentary, I mean, they mentioned it, but they didn't really go into it a lot, was how the U.S. backed this coup. And I think that's really important because they talk about later, and we'll get into kind of the disappearances and stuff, but it's not just Pele was going against, potentially the military dictatorship if he challenged them. He'd be going against the United States. So, this is quite big. So some very quick notes before I get your kind of thoughts on this. So in 1969, they get a new military dictator, and that is Emilio Medici. And this is when the reign gets really nasty and violent and oppressive, and disappearances start happening. 1 minute you're with your family, the next minute you're in a rotting jail cell, or you're, somewhere never to be seen again. And this happened a lot. And this happened under Medici in 1969, and that's when it really started to get bad. And that's why it kind of mixes with football in the 1970 World Cup. We'll get into more of that in a moment. But, so Dave, do you think that Pele should have done more or could have done more? Or, because this is kind of the big argument in the documentary, is should he have done more?
I think for starters, quite obviously, neither of us are in a place to say it, and we've never had to deal with anything like that. So there's no rule book for it. One of the interesting things, though, that's brought into the documentary is a mention of Muhammad Ali and what he was doing with almost at this exact same time in the US. His was the late 60s, and this was a little bit earlier for the most part. And one of the things with Muhammad Ali, and currently right now, he's, back in the stories and news again, because there's a movie that came out called One Night in Miami that talks about, or is a, fake story about his conversations with Malcolm X and Sam Cooke and Jim Brown when he beat Sonny Liston as a 22-year-old. Was Muhammad Ali kind of wrote the playbook for what he did. He wasn't following in anyone's footsteps. And today, if LeBron James is an activist, he's following in the footsteps of a Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, of a Bill Russell, of a Muhammad Ali. But he was writing that playbook as he was going along. And so there wasn't anything for Pele to follow in that style. And so it was Pele's decision to kind of become a first and try and do that. And he shied away from that. And some of his former teammates talked about it in the documentary. And I think they felt let down by it. And Pele, I thought they didn't ask a ton of questions about it, and you can understand why, but they've asked him more about it than anyone else in, the history of time. And he gave more answers of, I was never forced to do anything, but I understood the power dynamic and I was open to anyone. So I think a lot of people would have liked to see him do more. But one of the things I think back on is, while Muhammad Ali is a hero for what he did and the strength he showed there was a civil rights movement that he was kind of following in line with. He wasn't the leader of this movement. You had so many people inside and outside of sports who were also kind of pushing this. Pele would have been the first one, the face kind of out against this military dictatorship, which I think, Josh, is a lot to ask for from an athlete.
Yeah. I mean, I want to read his quotes just so that like people get proper context. He said in the documentary, quote, "I've been invited to participate in politics, but honestly, I've got no desire to get involved. I don't understand anything about politics." And then when he was asked about kind of what did he know about the disappearances and the torture, he said, quote, "If I told you I didn't know anything, I would be lying." You know, so I think it would be pretty like, it would be asking a lot to make him not only be the, you know, greatest footballer ever or the greatest football player of his time, but then also to make him like the preeminent, you know, social activist and political activist of his time as well. Like that's a lot to put on someone. And I think it's unrealistic to make people, you know, have to be perfect, right, at all times. You know, you said his teammates seemed a little disappointed. One of his black teammates, Kaju, who they have in the documentary, he said, you know, he's a black man who only said, "Yes, sir." And, you know, maybe I missed this in the documentary, even though I saw the documentary just yesterday and even a little bit more today. Like, what were his teammates doing?
It's hard, though, when there's one face,
Yeah.
right? Like, what are you going to do and say that Pele's not bigger than you for? And that's kind of where I felt that comment from Kaju was he was hoping he would be the leader and that they would follow.
Yeah.
And maybe no one ever came to him and said, "Hey, you need to do this and we'll support you," which
Yeah.
I agree with you, Josh. That's on him. But at the same time, he's Pele for a reason, right? And they go into
Yeah.
the story in 66. The team's kind of flipped over to a young team. He's the leader at 25, which is unfair. He is completely the leader. And Garrincha as well, who doesn't get mentioned at all in this documentary, which is I was very upset about because that's, you know, unfair. And we'll talk about him in a little bit because I want to bring him back when we talk about Maradona at the end. But they were the leaders. And so it was his role to lead in that way. Now, he may not have been told he would be supported by other players, which is fair to complain about. But if it wasn't his place, it was only him that was going to lead that, right? No one else was going to be the first one out without his support.
With the most power comes the most responsibility, right? So he did have a lot of power to do something about it. And that's why there's a little bit of resentment or, you know, annoyance that he didn't do more.
So I just think we have to bring up here, and it's a different time period. And again, as I said, with Muhammad Ali, there becomes a playbook and things change. But I would urge everyone to go out and read or watch or something about Socrates and what he did. He was captain of the Brazil national team in the 80s, and he spoke out against the government and against the dictatorship in Brazil. And he helped start a democratic political movement. And at one point he said, if there's no democracy, I'm not going to play in Brazil. And he left and went to Italy. And so he put himself on the line in a way that Pele didn't. Now, he had seen people do it around the world. And I think at that point, there was the seeds of weakness in the dictatorship and the military junta, whatever you want to call it, 20 or so years in. And you saw what had happened in Chile and Uruguay and Argentina. And so I think there was more of a framework for it. But this was a Brazilian captain coming out against that military government and standing for democracy. And so there is a space for it to happen, and there's always risk involved. Muhammad Ali lost the prime of his career when he stood against the Vietnam War. He was, I think, 27 or 26. Those are the primes of your career, and he wasn't able to box during that time. There are negatives in this, and I don't think you can, as I said, blame Pele, but there is examples of people who did stand up and did try and do something. So I urge everyone to go out and read and learn a little bit about Socrates.
You're totally right. And there's a book that, a lot of people, I haven't read it yet, but a lot of people like about this subject that came out a couple of years ago by Andrew Downey, which a lot of people recommend. So maybe that might be something that you should do this weekend. But, to go back, like, I do think that should not be the expectation, that you have to do something like that, because that is what makes a Muhammad Ali so special. What makes some of these guys, Nelson Mandela, if he didn't have to sacrifice 27 years, we wouldn't be talking about him, right? So that is what makes these guys special. I think what the movie it did for me was I didn't realize how early governments were kind of taking advantage of football. Like, the famous example is of the military junta in Argentina using the 1978 World Cup. But honestly, I had no idea about the Brazilian government using, football to this degree. I mean, they essentially in the documentary say that like they almost forced him to play the 1970 tournament that he didn't really want to, but they kind of pressured him into doing it anyway. The government kind of fired the coach right before the World Cup, like 2 months before the World Cup, and meddled with that. I mean, there's a great quote where, and what brought it on essentially was the national team coach, this is João Saldana, said, quote, "I do not mess with his cabinet. He will not mess with my team." And he was talking about Medici. And of course, Medici did not.
I think he got fired 2 days later. So, yeah, he does mess with your team. That's kind of how that works.
Yeah, but like this is the first time that I really think you're kind of seeing sports, and football and politics really mesh so much, and people kind of harnessing and appreciating the power of sport and of its political power. And just as an example, Medici, after they won the World Cup, they declared it a national holiday. They gave each player a ton of money, and he had some comments that were like directly linking the team's success and the success of the nation and the government, and took a lot of photos together. So like this was, really big. And this is kind of the first time that you really see kind of almost like sports washing. So did you have any thoughts about that? Like seeing that for the first time?
So one of the interesting ones in the documentary was a writer who was against the government, who had gone to the World Cup. And he was like, I went there to root against Brazil. And then Pele gets on the field in the yellow jersey, and your body takes over. And I kind of felt that even watching it back. I mean, we already know what happens, right? But you're in that half mind where you're like, I want to root for them on the field, but I also know what this represents. And they kind of talk about a need for a win at the time for that Brazilian government, because they need to convince people that things are going well to not have revolution against them. I think one of the reasons because I think your points are well taken of like, this is one of the earlier times of using football for whitewashing. So Hitler didn't like soccer. And one of the times he finally invested in it, the Germans lost at home. And he was like, I don't have time for this sport. So he used athletics, like the Olympics, to kind of support his ideas. I know the Italians, though, in 34, under Mussolini, they used soccer to show their strength and their power and the greatness of their country. And there's question marks around the refereeing in that tournament, because when a dictator invites the referee to his house the night before a final, it's questionable which way the calls are going to go the next day. And then obviously you have Franco and Real Madrid and what he did with that club to support them. And the other great star of this time, Di Stefano, and in those teams in their European championships and stuff. But those were little moments. And I think this was the biggest one of like the Brazilian national team and the Brazilian dictatorship and Brazil as a country all formed into one and saying we all are the same thing. And that gave them the cover to exist as they did. And I think if they don't win that 70 World Cup, I think there's a question if the dictatorship would have stood, which is the negative and positive of this moment.
Yeah, totally. Right. And we started this conversation talking about how important the 1970 World Cup was for the Brazilian national team in general, with not just the jerseys, but, they win their third tournament, which is, puts them above every other nation at that point. So it like you really see the good and the bad. And I do think it is just interesting how like it was not just the military dictatorship, but even before that, not letting him leave the country. It was a democratically elected president that did that. So, really interesting. I think this is a good time to kind of like take us towards the end of our conversation and look at kind of going forward. There's been a lot of talk about the greatest of all time recently, who the GOAT is, Messi, Ronaldo, obviously Maradona died not too long ago. And then last week we had Haaland and Mbappe making a lot of headlines for their goals in Europe in the Champions League. So how did this documentary kind of alter your view on the GOAT?
So I will start with this. I think it's an impossible discussion. I think comparing errors in any sport, but especially when you're looking at the time periods you are in football, is impossible. So I'll start with that. But in trying to get into it, the documentary was nice to see Pele as a player again, and not this, as you said, the ambassador that gets rolled out before every competition, this sort of like cartoonish character that gets put into things. And the cool part about the documentary is whenever you see Pele, it's the 3 touches or 2 touches before a goal or the volley, and that's it. Like, you don't ever see him operate inside the box. And then he talks about, I'm not even center forward. I want to play in midfield. And they show him coming back and winning the ball in full field runs and getting tackled and winning headers. And so I think there was like, it kind of brought me back into, oh, right, him as an actual player. And the one thing that stood out in the documentary, well, 2. One is the quality of goals in big moments. Because one of the things that I've always said is Diego Maradona's goal against England is the greatest goal of all time, not just because of the goal, but because it's a World Cup semifinal. Like, those 2 things alone create that moment, and then you combine them and it's untouchable. But the goals he scored in World Cup finals against Sweden, as you said, in 58, all those are amazing. And the other is his physicality. And you just see him in this documentary and he could play today. And that's kind of one of those big debate points is like, oh, well, they wouldn't be able to like play in another era. And like, he is so fit and he's so impressive, not just skilled and intelligent, but impressive, that he probably could have played in the 80s, in the 90s. Like, that kind of had hit me for the first time.
Yeah, it's one of those things when you watch, a greatest of all time in any sport, it looks like they're playing a different sport than the people they're playing it with, right? It looks like they're going at a different speed, or they're seeing the game just a bit faster, and it's totally different. And you get that with Pele, and you get to see his misses, like in the documentary, which is just fun to watch him, not even score all the time, but like literally just get very close. And you totally get that greatest of all time feeling, just seeing like a couple of the goals immediately. You're like, oh yeah, I can see why this guy is known as like the greatest of all time. So I think everything you said about comparing eras totally applies. But I think the thing that definitely kind of stood out to me watching this, and as we embark on the potential careers of Haaland and Mbappe, is, to me, you can't be the greatest of all time or in the discussion of the greatest of all time if you don't have that impact in your time, like where people not are just losing their mind or like really into you're super famous, but you have that effect where like you impact a nation, or you impact how the sport is played and how they talk about the sport, or like you need to have that impact. And Haaland might score 40 goals a season for the rest of his career and have 1,000, but like if he doesn't lift a nation to, I'm not saying he has to win the World Cup, but like you have to lift a nation, you have to lift something, you have to change the way people look at so-and-so. And I think, that's what I took away from this, is that he changed the way people looked at Brazil. He changed the way football was played. He changed so much about the game, Pele. And so like, if you even want to be in the conversation with him, you need to be doing the same. It'll always be hard to like surpass or even get on the level that Pele was, because of those impacts that he had outside of just the field, off the field.
So I agree with you. I also have another thought process in watching this and thinking about what makes a global superstar and what makes these icons. And one is, it's sort of luck. And it's not luck in terms of their career, but it's luck in terms of time. Because when you look back,
oh, totally.
I think Pele is the star of television, right? That was the start of global TV and color TV. I think Maradona was that next level of, well, now you can watch all these games and you can kind of see people more consistently. Plus his combination into like off the field, he was a diva and this star. And that's kind of what people wanted in the 80s. Michael Jordan, no question. He was a product of his time period. And it was the globalization of the world into the internet. And I think Messi and Ronaldo are the social media era global icons. And that doesn't take away from, those are probably, and LeBron James now as well in that category. And I bring in basketball because I think those are the global icons in sports that are untouched, is, mainly footballers and basketball players. They may still all be the greatest players of all time, but that time period matters. And so I brought up Garrincha before, and he was the dribbler and he was the hope of the masses. He was an alcoholic. He was bow-legged because he was malnutritioned as a kid. He was from the favelas. And he didn't break through at the same time, whether it was because of TV, whether it was because of Pele, whether it because of himself, when Maradona was all those things and it brought him to this level. And I think some of that is just luck and timing for some people. And I would say for the international piece, you're saying the World Cup is part of that. Did you peak at a World Cup? Right? Because there are players that had better periods in their career and their time, but it didn't peak in those 4 years when there was a World Cup. And so the world didn't pay attention, because the one thing the World Cup does over everything else is it's an event for non-sports fans. Everyone watches the World Cup. And so if you succeed there, you move outside of the realm of football into pop culture. And that's what Maradona and Pele did so well. And I think Messi's done that because the way the world's changed, and he's been to how many finals, so everyone's seen that. But I think that is kind of the difference in thinking about this and watching this, how kind of fragile the ability to do this is. And it doesn't change, the careers of a Cruyff or Eusebio or Beckenbauer or Platini or any of those players. But I think it's interesting the moments that happen for players and how it happens, in that Maradona and Pele may not be the only great players. And when you read the stories from these countries, there's always the legends, right? The guy who lived in Rosario and never wanted to leave and was the best player ever, but no one ever saw him. And there's always those tales, which, locals love to hang on to. But it's amazing to me how close it is for these global icons to almost not happen.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. And about timing and pretty much everything you just said. I just want to add one more thing to that. So, if we look towards Haaland and Mbappe, this is the reason why I do think Mbappe, even if Haaland scores as many goals and, even if they're roughly comparable as players right now today, I think people will look at Mbappe totally different, when he retires, because he did have that World Cup moment. It's not quite maybe Pele, 58 World Cup, but he did have a moment in a World Cup and they won. And I could totally see the narrative being around him, when he's done, similar with France, in that he lifted France up, to this world power. Not that it wasn't already before, but he took maybe they win another World Cup, and that France is the team for this decade, and people are like, oh my God, well, why wasn't it like this before? They make all the best players, and he's kind of the symbol of that. So does this change, I guess, how you view kind of Haaland and Mbappe, or maybe there's someone else that you see with them?
So I had two thoughts coming into this podcast. One is the absence of that legend will leave another legend who may not be equal. And this is my best comparison. Michael Jordan retired, and Kobe Bryant became the next Michael Jordan, because everyone had been so used to having that one guy. And so you had to elevate someone else and put them in that space where we can talk about the off-court stuff with Kobe Bryant, which is despicable, and one of the reasons that I root for him. But he was never on a level with Michael Jordan, but everyone needed the next Michael Jordan. That's just the way the mind, you'd kind of been trained at that point to have that person. And so I think there's a chance that the Mbappe, Haaland, whoever else it is, may be elevated to a Messi, Ronaldo conversation without actually deserving to be in it, until the next guy comes along, which in basketball was LeBron, and we don't know who the next one will be. And I think you could say David Beckham kind of fell into that spot of, you had Maradona, you had Zidane, and then there was kind of an in-between period without one established or two established great stars. And I think that's kind of where he fell. And so it sort of elevated him, and it's not taking away from those players. But I'm curious to see if that's what happens, or if there are players that step up and are that great. I mean, Mbappe was the first teenager to score in a World Cup final since Pele. So maybe he is that level. The other is, and I don't know if this is chicken or egg, and I think it's something for us to chew on and maybe come back to, is, so you think about the top players, and you think about, let's just say the top 10, right? Roughly. So you've got Maradona, you've got Messi, Ronaldo, the original Ronaldo, the Cristiano, Pele, Zidane, Cruyff, Beckenbauer. There's a few other names that kind of go in there.
We don't have to go through all of them, but there's a lot. Yeah.
I would say 90% of them played for Barcelona or Real Madrid. And I don't know if they're on that stage because they played for Barcelona and Real Madrid, or if that's where Barcelona and Real Madrid sit as the two great clubs where they acquire those guys. But it was fascinating to me. And Maradona, I don't think made his name with Barca, so that's a little different. But it was fascinating in thinking about this, realizing the connection of those two clubs with this absurd level that a handful of people have reached in world history.
I think that's a really good place to leave it. Thank you so much for taking the time, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.
And before you go, if you like today's episode, why not subscribe to our Patreon page where you'll get access to bonus episodes and extra content. The music for this episode was provided by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about the music in the episode show notes. Thanks for listening to Football Today. We'll be back on Monday with another episode in our usual format. See you then.